mean I'll see it.
The silence of a school in the middle of summer isn't just quiet, it's unnatural. It feels like the building is holding its breath, waiting for the swarm of bodies and the constant hum of voices to return so it can pretend to be a normal place again. When I stepped through the heavy side doors that July afternoon, the transition from the humid, sticky heat of the parking lot to the dead, stagnant air of the interior made my skin crawl. I was only there to grab my official transcripts for a late college application, a simple errand that should have taken 10 minutes. The administration office had told me the side entrance would be propped open for the janitorial staff, but as soon as the door clicked shut behind me, I felt a sudden, oppressive urge to turn around and leave. The main hallway stretched out before me, looking miles longer than it ever did during the semester. Without the roar of 1,000 students, the space felt massive and hollow. The fluorescent lights were all killed, leaving the corridor in a state of permanent, sickly gray twilight filtered through the dirty transom windows. It was a liminal space, a graveyard for memories that weren't quite dead yet. Faded posters for a prom that had already happened were beginning to curl and peel away from the cinder block walls like dead skin. The air was thick and tasted of stale floor wax and the faint, sour ghost of 1,000 discarded cafeteria sandwiches. It was a cloying, metallic scent that seemed to stick to the back of my throat, making it difficult to swallow. Every step I took echoed. It wasn't just a click of my shoes, it was a sharp, biting crack that traveled down the linoleum and bounced off the rows of lockers. Those lockers looked different now. When they're stuffed with books and jackets, they're just furniture. Empty, they looked like upright coffins, hundreds of them, all standing in a silent, jagged line. I found myself walking right down the center of the hallway, subconsciously staying as far away from those metal doors as possible. I had this irrational, gnawing fear that one of them might just pop open, revealing something that had been trapped inside since graduation. As I passed the entrance to the gymnasium, I stopped. The double doors were secured with thick, rusted chains wrapped tightly around the handles, but from the other side, I heard it. A rhythmic, steady sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was the unmistakable sound of a basketball hitting the hardwood floor. It wasn't a fast-paced game, it was slow, deliberate, as if someone was standing in the center of the dark court, just letting the ball fall and return to their hand. I stared at the gap between the doors, but it was pitch black inside. The sound was so clear, so physical, that I could almost feel the vibration in the soles of my feet. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, uneven beat that made my vision blur at the edges. I told myself it was just the ventilation system or perhaps a stray ball settling after weeks of being stuck in the rafters. But the rhythm was too perfect. Thump, thump, thump. It was patient. I leaned in just an inch, my curiosity momentarily overriding the cold dread pooling in my stomach, and that's when the sound changed. The bouncing stopped mid-air. There was no final roll of the ball across the floor. Just instant, suffocating silence. Then I heard the scuffle of a rubber sole against the gym floor. It was a long, dragging sound, like someone pulling a limp, weighted object across the wood. It was moving toward the doors. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. I didn't want to see what was on the other side of those chains. I didn't want to see the face of whatever was playing in the dark. I turned my back on the gym and hurried toward the main office, my pace quickening into a panicked shuffle. The administrative wing was even worse. The glass windows of the office were dark, and the door was locked tight. I peered through the glass into the reception area, seeing the empty desks and the silent telephones. On the far wall, a digital clock blinked a steady, rhythmic red, but the numbers were garbled, displaying symbols that didn't make any sense. As I stood there, a movement in the reflection of the glass caught my eye. At the far end of the hallway I had just walked down, a shadow was stretching out. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was a dense, ink-like void that seemed to be sliding out from the locker alcove near the gym. I didn't wait for my transcripts. I didn't care about my college applications or the fact that I'd wasted the drive. I turned and began to run back toward the side exit, but the hallway seemed to be expanding, the exit sign glowing a dull, mocking red in the distance. The smell in the air shifted. The floor wax was gone, replaced by a pungent, overwhelming stench of rot and something sharply acidic. It was the smell of a locker left closed for a decade with something wet and organic trapped inside. As I ran, I passed the chemistry lab. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. I shouldn't have looked, but I couldn't help it. The interior of the lab was coated in a dark, glistening film. It wasn't paint. It was a deep, brownish-red substance that looked thick and viscous, dripping from the blacked-up lab tables and pooling on the floor. It looked like the room had been turned inside out. The stench of it was unbearable, a raw, iron-like odor that was so intense I could taste it on my tongue, thick and cloying. There were no bodies, just the aftermath of something that had been utterly dismantled. I reached the side doors and slammed my weight against the crash bar. For a horrifying second, it didn't budge. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore at my throat and threw my entire body against the metal. The door burst open, and I tumbled out into the blinding, wonderful sunlight of the parking lot. I didn't stop until I was inside my car with the doors locked and the engine roaring to life. I looked back at the school as I peeled out of the lot. The building sat there, squat and silent under the summer sun, looking perfectly ordinary. But as I glanced at the second-story windows of the library, I saw a hand. It was pressed flat against the glass, the palm pale and mottled with dark, bruising spots. The fingers were unnaturally long, and as I watched, it began to slide slowly down the pane, leaving a wide, translucent streak of moisture behind. The school wasn't empty. It was just wearing a mask when we were there, pretending to be a place of learning in loud hallways. But when the students leave, the mask comes off, and the building becomes something else entirely, a predator that feeds on the echoes of what's left behind. I still haven't gone back for those papers. I don't think I ever will. Every time I pass a school during the summer now, I don't see a building, I see a mouth, waiting for someone to walk inside and become part of the silence. My skin still feels stained by that smell, that thick, wet scent of things that should have stayed buried, and I can still hear that basketball bouncing in the back of my mind, waiting for me to come back and play.
Next story.
The development was called Oak Ridge Estates, but there weren't any oaks, and there certainly wasn't a ridge. It was just an endless stretch of flat, gray dirt about 40 miles outside of the city, carved into perfect rectangular lots. I took the job because the pay was ridiculous for what was described as overnight asset protection. Basically, I just had to sit in the flagship model home and make sure nobody broke in to strip the copper wiring or spray paint the pristine siding before the grand opening. When I first pulled up, the house looked like a dream. It was one of those massive, farmhouse-style builds with a wraparound porch and those big windows that make everything inside look like a jewelry box. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a magazine. Everything was perfectly curated. The air didn't even smell like a house, it smelled like nothing. It was a complete absence of scent, scrubbed clean of any human trace. I set my bag down on the kitchen island, which was a massive slab of white marble. I remember running my hand over it and thinking how cold it was. Usually, stone holds a bit of the room's temperature, but this felt like it had been pulled out of a freezer. I started doing my first walkthrough, just a standard sweep to make sure I was alone. The staging was incredible. There were plush rugs, expensive-looking throw blankets draped over the backs of armchairs, and bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics. It wasn't until I reached for a copy of The Great Gatsby that the first crack in the reality of the place showed up. I pulled on the spine, but it didn't move. I tugged harder, and the entire row of books shifted as one solid piece. They weren't books. It was a single block of molded plastic, painted and textured to look like individual volumes. It was a hollow shell. I felt a slight chill, but I laughed it off. Staging a house is expensive, so I figured they were just cutting corners on the props. Around midnight, the silence started to get to me. New houses usually creak or moan as the foundation settles, but this place was too quiet. There was no hum from the refrigerator, no ticking of a clock, no distant sound of traffic. I decided to make some coffee to stay awake, but when I tried to open the cabinets, they wouldn't budge. I looked closer and realized there were no hinges. The cabinet doors were just decorative panels glued directly to the drywall. I went to the fridge to see if there was a bottle of water inside. When I pulled the handle, the entire unit shifted forward. It was light, absurdly light. I pulled it open and found myself staring at a solid wall of white plastic. There was no shelving, no motor, no cooling element. It was just a hollow box shaped like an appliance. That was when the atmosphere in the room shifted. You know that feeling when you realize you're being watched, but you can't pinpoint where the eyes are? It was like that, only the house itself felt like the observer. I felt a sudden, urgent need to use the bathroom. I walked down the hall to the guest suite and stepped inside. The porcelain of the toilet looked real enough, but when I lifted the lid, I saw there was no water. There wasn't even a hole at the bottom of the bowl. It was just a solid, shallow dip of ceramic. I reached for the sink faucet, and the handle snapped off in my hand. It wasn't metal. It was painted resin. There were no pipes under the sink. Just empty, dark space behind a fake wooden facade. I decided I was done. The security gig wasn't worth the creeping sensation that I was standing in a life-size dollhouse built by someone who had only ever seen a human home in pictures. I grabbed my bag from the kitchen and headed for the front door. I turned the deadbolt, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the night air. Except I didn't. I stepped onto a plush, beige carpet. I looked up and saw a white marble kitchen island. I saw my own coffee thermos sitting exactly where I had left it. I turned around, thinking I'd somehow gotten turned around in the dark, but the door I had just walked through was gone. In its place was a solid wall with a framed picture of a generic mountain landscape. I wasn't outside. I was in the exact same living room. I started to panic. I ran to the windows and tried to look out, but the glass was thick and distorted, like the bottom of an old soda bottle. I could see the faint glow of the streetlights outside, but they looked miles away. I grabbed a decorative brass lamp from a side table and swung it at the window. The lamp didn't shatter the glass. It didn't even make a sound. The lamp just bent. It was made of some sort of soft, rubbery material, and the window felt like hitting a wall of solid rubber. It absorbed the blow and pushed back. I ran to the back of the house, looking for the sliding glass door. I found it, ripped the curtain aside, and threw the latch. I stepped through the frame, heart hammering against my ribs, and found myself standing in the entryway of a third house. This one was different. It was the same layout, the same furniture, but the details were starting to degrade. The wax fruit in the bowl on the dining table wasn't just plastic anymore. It looked like it was melting. The apples were lumpy and gray, oozing a thick, clear liquid that smelled like industrial solvent. The smell was the first thing that really hit me. It wasn't the smell of decay. It was the smell of a chemical fire that had been put out with bleach. It burned the back of my throat and made my eyes water. I kept moving, thinking if I just kept going through the doors, I'd eventually hit a wall or a real exit. I went through the kitchen, through the garage door, through the master bedroom closet. Every door led back to the same living room, but each time, the house felt more hungry. By the fifth house, the furniture started to change. I tried to sit on the sofa to catch my breath, but as soon as I sat down, the fabric felt wet. I looked down and saw the beige microfiber was pulsing. It wasn't a mechanical pulse, it was rhythmic, like a slow, deep heartbeat. The cushions began to sink, not under my weight, but like they were actively pulling me in. The fabric started to wrap around my thighs, the fibers sticking to my jeans like tiny, microscopic hooks. I scrambled off and fell onto the floor. The floor wasn't hardwood. It looked like oak, but when my palms hit it, the surface was tacky and warm. I pulled my hands away, and a string of translucent, sticky fluid stretched between my skin and the floorboards. It looked like saliva. I stood up, shaking, and that's when I saw the owner. He was standing in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. At first, he looked like a normal guy in a polo shirt and khakis, the kind of person you'd see in a real estate brochure. But he wasn't moving. He was perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides. As I got closer, I realized his skin had the same matte finish as the wax fruit. There were no pores, no hair, no lines around his eyes. His face was a smooth, molded approximation of a human expression. He didn't have eyes. Where the eyes should have been, there were just shallow indentations painted with glossy black circles. He didn't breathe. He just stood there, a prop in a house of props. Then his mouth opened. It didn't hinge like a human jaw. The plastic of his face just split apart, stretching and tearing like warm taffy. There were no teeth inside, just a dark, cavernous hole that smelled like that same stinging chemical solvent. A sound came out of him, not a voice, but the sound of air being forced through a narrow plastic pipe. A high-pitched, whistling moan. I turned and bolted through the next door. I've lost count of how many houses I've been through now. I think I'm on 12, or maybe 14. The degradation is getting worse. In this house, the walls are soft. If I press my finger against the drywall, it leaves an indentation that slowly fills back in, like memory foam. The smell of the blood here, if you can even call it that, isn't like iron or copper. It's sickly sweet, like rotting maraschino cherries mixed with burning tires. It's thick and oily, and it's leaking from the electrical outlets. I found a body in the kitchen of the last house. It looked like it had tried to eat the wax fruit. Its throat was blocked with a solid mass of colorful plastic, and its chest had been opened up. There were no organs inside. Just bundles of multicolored wires and thick, gray insulation. It wasn't a person. It was just another part of the staging. The most terrifying part isn't the people or the melting furniture. It's the feeling that the house is learning. Every time I enter a new version, the doors stay open a little longer, like it's inviting me to stay. The sofa in this room is currently vibrating, and the beige fabric has turned a deep, bruised purple. It's spread across the floor, slowly creeping toward my boots. I'm sitting on the kitchen island now because it's the only thing that still feels solid, but even the marble is starting to feel soft, like half-dried clay. I can hear the whistling sound coming from the hallway again. There are more of them now. I can see their shadows through the glass of the bedroom door. They aren't walking, they're sliding, their plastic feet dragging across the tacky floorboards. I have one more door to try. It's the one in the basement. I haven't gone down there yet because the stairs look like they're made of raw, unpainted meat, and the air coming up from the dark is so thick with that chemical stench I can barely breathe. But the whistling is getting louder. The man in the polo shirt is at the end of the kitchen, his jaw hanging open, his painted eyes fixed on mine. If you're reading this, don't look for the Oak Ridge development. Don't go into the model homes. There's a reason they look so perfect from the outside. They're just lures. And once the door closes behind you, the house starts to realize you're the only thing inside that's actually real. It doesn't want to let that reality go. It wants to keep it. It wants to wrap itself around you until you're just another prop on the shelf. I'm going into the basement now. I don't think it's an exit, but I can't stay on the island anymore. The marble is starting to grow hair.
Next story.
Working in a high-rise cubicle farm at 3 in the morning changes the way you perceive space. The air feels thicker, like you're wading through invisible syrup, and the silence isn't actually silent. It's a vibrating, low-frequency hum that makes your teeth ache if you focus on it for too long. I've always been the type to stay late, mostly because the pay's good and the commute is non-existent at that hour, but after what happened, I can't even look at a fluorescent light bulb without feeling sick to my stomach. The floor I work on is a massive, open-plan nightmare. Rows upon rows of gray dividers, ergonomic chairs, and cluttered desks that look like a graveyard for productivity once everyone goes home. Around midnight, the building's power-saving mode kicks in. The overhead lights shut off in waves, beginning at the far end of the floor and marching toward my desk until the only thing left is the harsh, blue-white glare of my dual monitors. It leaves the rest of the floor in a state of absolute, impenetrable shadow. I was grinding through a data migration project that was well behind schedule. The hum of the server room down the hall was the only thing keeping me company, a steady drone that eventually starts to sound like a choir of people all humming the same flat note. I remember standing up to stretch my back, my joints popping in the quiet air. When I looked out over the sea of cubicles, the shadows played a trick on my eyes. The tops of the gray partitions looked like jagged, square teeth in the mouth of some massive, sleeping beast. I laughed it off at first, blaming the lack of sleep and the third pot of coffee, but the feeling of being watched started to prickle at the back of my neck. I decided I needed a break. My brain was fried, and the blue light was starting to give me a piercing migraine. I figured I'd head to the break room, grab a stale protein bar, and maybe splash some cold water on my face. The walk across the floor felt longer than usual. Every time I passed an empty desk, I expected someone to reach out from the footwell and grab my ankle. The darkness beyond the reach of the emergency exit signs was so dense it felt solid. The break room is nestled in the corner of the building, a small area with a couple of vending machines, a sink, and a few round tables. As I approached the door, I saw a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. I wasn't alone. That should have been a relief, right? But in a building where I knew for a fact I was the only one scanned into the security system for this floor, seeing a light on made my stomach drop into my shoes. I pushed the door open slowly. Sitting at the far table, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single recessed light, was my boss, Miller. He was still wearing his gray suit jacket, but his posture was all wrong. He was slumped forward, his arms resting on the table, staring straight ahead at the wall. He didn't have a coffee mug or a laptop. He was just sitting there in the dark. I cleared my throat, the sound feeling like a gunshot in the small room. I asked him if he was pulling an all-nighter too, trying to keep my voice casual, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Miller didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sat there, as stiff as a mannequin in a department store. After a few seconds of agonizing silence, he slowly raised his right arm. He didn't look at me, he didn't even tilt his head. He just extended one long, pale finger and pointed toward the industrial microwave sitting on the counter behind him. I thought it was a joke at first. Miller was a dry guy, always leaning into that weird corporate humor. I walked toward the counter, my legs feeling like lead, wondering if he'd hidden a birthday cake in there or something equally mundane. The closer I got, the more I noticed a smell. It wasn't the smell of burnt popcorn or old soup. It was a dense, metallic scent that coated the back of my throat. It reminded me of the time I'd accidentally cut my hand open on a rusted fence, thick, salty, and cloyingly sweet. It was the unmistakable odor of a butcher shop that hadn't been cleaned in a week. I reached for the handle of the microwave. My hand was slick with sweat. I pulled the door open, and the internal light flickered on. My own face was staring back at me. It wasn't a mask. It wasn't a clever practical joke. It was my head, severed cleanly at the base of the neck, sitting on the glass rotating plate. The eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an expression of total, soul-crushing boredom. The skin was a pale, waxy yellow, and the lips were pulled back slightly to reveal teeth stained with a dark, drying fluid. The most horrifying part wasn't the gore, it was the fact that the head looked exactly like I felt. It looked tired. It looked like it was waiting for the clock to hit 5 so it could finally go home. The base of the microwave was flooded with a dark, viscous pool of liquid that had begun to coagulate into a jelly-like substance. It wasn't bright red anymore. It had turned a deep, bruised purple, almost black in the artificial light. I could see the jagged ends of the windpipe and the white shimmer of the spinal column where the neck had been torn, not cut, but torn away from the shoulders. I backed away, my boots slipping on something wet on the floor that I hadn't noticed before. I looked down and saw a trail of that same dark fluid leading from the table where Miller was sitting over to the sink. I looked back at Miller. He finally turned his head. His face wasn't a face anymore. It was a hollowed-out shell. His eyes were gone, replaced by two pits of darkness that seemed to swallow the light of the room. His mouth opened, and instead of words, a thick, ropus strand of that dark fluid leaked out over his chin, staining his white shirt. He didn't scream. He didn't move to attack me. He just sat there, leaking and empty, while my own severed head began to rotate slowly inside the microwave as the machine suddenly groaned to life. The hum of the microwave joined the hum of the server room, creating a dissonant, vibrating roar in my ears. I turned and bolted. I didn't grab my bag. I didn't grab my coat. I ran through the dark office, tripping over chairs and slamming into cubicle walls. The shadows seemed to be reaching for me now, the gray dividers feeling like they were closing in, the teeth of the beast finally snapping shut. I burst through the stairwell door and sprinted down 12 flights of stairs, my lungs burning and my vision blurring. I didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air, standing under a street lamp. I stood there for a long time, gasping for breath, waiting for the security guards to come out or for the police to arrive. But the building just sat there, silent and looming, a monolith of glass and steel. I never went back. I didn't even call to quit. I just blocked every number associated with that company. About a week later, I got a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was my employee ID badge. It was covered in dried, dark brown stains, and the plastic was cracked right across the middle of my face. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the house gets too quiet, I can still hear that low-frequency hum. I can still smell that thick, metallic sweetness. And I wonder if I'm really the one out here, or if I'm still sitting in that break room, rotating slowly on a glass plate, waiting for the timer to ding. Most nights, I don't sleep at all. I just stare at the shadows on my ceiling and wait for the lights to go out.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.